Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Postmodern Predicament, Existential Challenges of the 21st Century, by Bruce Ackerman. Narrated by Jonathan Todd Ross. Publisher's note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to tables present in the print and ebook formats of the book. Introduction. An existential question. What should I make of my life? Through most of human history, almost nobody took this question seriously. They didn't have to. The overwhelming majority of men and women were illiterate peasants who lived their entire lives without ever leaving their place of birth. Instead of taking responsibility for defining the shape of their individual lives, each existed as an I who passively accepted the social identity imposed upon them by their tightly knit communities, typically numbering no more than 1,000 inhabitants. As soon as they became aware of their social surroundings, they knew it would be very difficult to hide anything important from local busybodies. By the time they became young adults, it was unthinkable for them to declare their independence from the patterns of social life in which they had been socialized, even when they found them oppressive. If they insisted on challenging the status quo, their village counterparts would treat them as pariahs, or even threaten their lives. If they did not rapidly and publicly admit the error of their ways, they would find it tough to engage in the successful operation of their farm or trade, as this frequently required the cooperation of their contemptuous neighbors. Worse yet, it would be virtually impossible to begin a new life elsewhere. They would have to leave behind the community and local property that served as their principal source of wealth. When they arrived in another closely knit community, they would enter as a stranger whose weird behavior would encounter greater hostility than they had experienced in their original home. Given these realities, pre-moderns were stuck with the social identity imposed from birth by their tight-knit communities. If I had been assigned the status of a lowly servant, I would have no choice but to accept my fate and deal with my humiliations as best I could. Nor could I take the path that seems obvious to us today, fleeing to a big city in search of new opportunities for self-realization. As late as 1800, only 4 cities in Western Europe had 200,000 inhabitants, with Paris 550,000 and Naples 430,000 topping the list. Despite the great cathedrals and mansions dominating the skyline, the residents of these cities treated impoverished newcomers with deep suspicion, which is precisely why so few of them arrived. In capital cities, there was always a king or prince who asserted his dominion over the surrounding countryside. But these aristocrats typically lacked the bureaucratic and military resources required to act decisively when tightly knit communities mistreated or murdered members who insisted on defining their own meaning in life. So-called sovereigns exercised little actual power, other than to insist that each agrarian community recognize their dominion by paying them an annual tribute of goods and services. If community members complied, they could be confident their overlords would allow them to brutally suppress local deviants in blatant violation of the law books found in the monarch's faraway capital. When communities defaulted on their tribute payments, their putative governors often found it hard to compel compliance, encouraging further acts of defiance. Similarly, tightly knit communities would typically reject strangers even if they shared a common faith in the nature of ultimate reality, as expressed by Buddha or Confucius or Jesus or Muhammad or Moses or Socrates or some other spiritual leader. The real-world meaning of their lives was based on their success in fulfilling the expectations of people they had known since childhood, and the mere fact that strangers shared common ideals did not make their concrete patterns of speaking and doing any less strange, given the very different forms of meaningful engagement into which they had been socialized from infancy. It would take a shattering series of cultural, economic, and political revolutions to break the stranglehold of tightly knit communities. For present purposes, it is enough to consider only one of these decisive transformations: the Industrial Revolution. By the 18th century, mass production techniques were already encouraging the development of factory towns that enabled families to escape their local communities with increasing confidence. By the 1830s, the rise of the railroad was enabling millions of Westerners, on both sides of the Atlantic, to say goodbye to their old-time neighbors and build better lives for themselves in a distant city. Yet if they were to succeed in fulfilling their hopes, these newcomers had no choice but to revolutionize the experiential foundations of their very existence. Once they moved to the city, they would no longer encounter the same familiar faces in the same familiar places. Instead, they would live very different lives at home and at work. While their family was still demanding displays of love and thoughtfulness, their fellow workers were demanding competence and cooperation. The fragmentation of their time into different spheres of intersubjective engagement required them to confront a paradigmatically modern predicament. Since their disparate sets of sphere-mates, as I will call them, expected very different things, they would devote time and energy to developing very different aspects of their character. Their loving expressions of thoughtfulness at home would be treated with bewilderment if they tried to hug their fellow workers on the assembly line, and vice versa. They encountered similar but different challenges in constructing meaningful relationships with next-door neighbors from very different parts of the country, as well as in establishing serious friendships with people they casually encountered in everyday life. Since each set of sphere-mates had very different expectations for meaningful performance, they would predictably make demands on your time and energy that seemed reasonable from their point of view. But taken together, you might be utterly unable to satisfy all of them for one simple reason. As a human being, you need at least 5 or 6 hours of sleep each night to sustain your existence in a satisfactory fashion during the rest of the day. As a consequence, you will regularly fail to live up to the expectations of your different sphere-mates for reasons that don't make sense to them. Your systematic underperformance, moreover, will increasingly alienate them, and they may well turn their backs on you if you cannot somehow reconcile them to repeated disappointments. A fundamental fact of human existence, the finitude of your waking life, confronts you with an inescapable predicament now that your days are split into different modes of face-to-face engagement, with different sphere-mates seeking your cooperation in achieving different forms of mutually meaningful self-realization. There is no way out of this existential predicament of modern life, which I will call the dilemma of interspherical commitment. Consider, for example, a tragic scenario that has shattered the lives of countless modern men and women over the course of the 20th century. For purposes of this thought experiment, I would like you to put yourself in the shoes of somebody named Bewildered, who is about to go home from work when the boss orders him or her to stay on the job and work overtime for several hours to meet a crucial deadline. As a practical matter, Bewildered has no choice but to comply with this demand, and encounters a grim reception upon returning home. Not only have I arrived too late to have dinner with my family, I've arrived too late to help my kids with their homework. My kids may well forgive me at first, but if I keep on working overtime, they will increasingly resent their failure to receive the loving help they need in responding to the demands of their schoolwork. After all, many of their schoolmates tell them how much their parents helped them out in solving their classroom assignments. As a consequence, a time may come when I open the door to say hello, only to find that my kids turn their backs on me, and deliberately exclude me from their ongoing activities. Worse yet, my spouse whispers to me that I will make the situation worse if I insist that my kids allow me to join in their fun and games. I respond by pretending that nothing is wrong. Rather than risking an angry confrontation, I leave my spouse playing with our kids in the living room and go into the kitchen to eat the dinner leftovers by myself, emerging from this self-imposed isolation only when I see my spouse send the kids to bed in the normal way. When my partner returns from the bedroom, I explain why I had no choice but to comply with my boss's demands. My spouse may well respond reassuringly that she understands, and the two of us spend the rest of the evening together in ways that reassure each other of the depth of our relationship. But as I return to business the next day, it's all too clear to me that my boss will be making many more demands for overtime in the future, and that I am facing the prospect of a bitter breakup at home when I arrive late the next time, and the next time, and the next. Yet if I fail to meet my employer's deadlines at work, my boss may well crush my hopes for career advancement, and may even fire me, forcing me to search desperately for a half-decent alternative. How to resolve this interspherical predicament? Rather than finding it surprising that so many modern men and women have been overwhelmed by this question, we should find it remarkable that many others manage to resolve their ongoing dilemmas in ways that enable them to sustain both their careers and their marriages in a deeply meaningful fashion. Yet even if your marriage breaks up and your career breaks down, your failed efforts to maintain them tells you something very important about yourself. That I am somebody who is struggling to make sense of my life as a whole, despite the fact that I will inevitably disappoint many of my very different sphere mates in my effort to construct a meaningful life for myself in the modern world. This ongoing struggle has been vastly complicated by the proliferation of additional relational opportunities over the 20th century. For example, my athletic abilities may have led my neighborhood soccer league to ask me to join one of their teams in competing for the local championship, but my neighborhood child care center may call upon me to devote myself to the care of youngsters who have been abandoned by their parents. At the same time, my fellow citizens may urge me to join a nationwide effort to challenge an entrenched form of social injustice. Each of us can say yes only to a few of these opportunities. Yet the more time and energy we devote to these additional spherical projects, the less time we have to dedicate ourselves to our job, and family and friends. And our repeated absences may well provoke more moments of bewildered alienation. People in the pre-modern era understood themselves very differently. Locked within their tightly knit communities, they were in no position to view themselves as self-determining human beings for the simple reason that their communities gave them no such choices, but treated them as deviants if they ever asserted themselves as an I, who could legitimately question the patterns of living assigned to them at birth. Yet listeners of this book have long since abandoned the tightly knit communities of their ancestors, which leaves them with two choices. They can hope they will be lucky enough to avoid bewildering existential tragedies in their own lives, and make desperate last-minute efforts to avoid breakups if they nevertheless arise. Or they can spend some time trying to gain a perspective on the fundamental predicaments of modern life and construct their spherical relationships in ways that self-consciously take their dilemmas of commitment into account. In urging you to take the second course, I will be following the path marked out by a series of great existentialist thinkers of the 20th century. Beginning with Edmund Husserl's breakthrough contribution in the early 1900s, which provided a framework for a dynamic intergenerational debate between writers like Simone de Beauvoir and Maurice Merleau-Ponty and Jean-Paul Sartre, to name the authors who have most influenced my own approach. These thinkers and doers, however, were not content to insist on the centrality of the predicament posed by the fragmentation of modern life into a host of competing spherical commitments, and the endless struggle for self-definition required as a result. Given the fragility of these multi-spherical engagements, they urged us to confront a clear and present danger to our personal integrity that is inextricably embedded in the very structure of contemporary existence. To see their point, consider that your spheremates are deeply familiar with your activities in only one of your modes of engagement. Your kids and spouse might never even meet your fellow workers, and vice versa. As a consequence, when you confront their inevitable disappointments, you are constantly tempted to minimize their alienation by misrepresenting the reasons for your failure to fulfill their expectations. When you arrive late to work, for example, you might ask your business associates to excuse the delay, since I had to take care of my sick child until my spouse could take over the task. But in fact, your kid was perfectly fine, and you were delayed because you had been celebrating your friend's birthday until 3 a.m, making it impossible to get out of bed on time. Nevertheless, your fellow workers find this excuse entirely credible. They express sympathy rather than annoyance when you finally show up, precisely because they don't see your children on a face-to-face basis, as they would in a tightly knit community. In short, you have managed to evade responsibility for your breach of your spheremates' expectations by transforming your work life into a lie. This stripped-down example only gestures toward the profound ways in which 20th century existentialists confronted their contemporaries with the pervasive danger of self-betrayal built into the structure of their lives. The source of modern inauthenticity is the sheer impossibility of escaping a fundamental feature of the human condition, that I only have 18 or 19 hours available to me between the time I wake up and the time I go to sleep. As a consequence, the physical isolation of each set of spheremates from their counterparts gives me constant opportunities to minimize their disappointments by misrepresenting the character of my extra-spherical relationships in ways they can't observe in face-to-face fashion. Worse yet, if I choose to deal with the oppressive character of some or all of my spherical relationships in a totally honest fashion, I confront a second danger. The political elites that currently dominate the government may view my displays of authenticity as challenges to the legitimacy of a system that requires me to work overtime to sustain my family's economic well-being, at the cost of destroying the meaningfulness of my intimate relationships. And they will do all they can to destroy my life if my denunciations of the status quo come to their attention. This is the point at which leading thinkers of the 20th century called upon their fellow citizens to take decisive action to reform the prevailing system of domination in the name of existential justice. Simone de Beauvoir's great work of 1949, The Second Sex, serves as a paradigmatic example of this call for creative forms of political organization in the struggle against continued subordination. At the time it was written, entrenched forms of gender domination enabled macho men to brutalize women at home and humiliate them at work if they did not voluntarily accept their continued subordination in either of these spheres of modern existence. Moreover, Beauvoir did not simply join with other leading feminists in denouncing these abuses as fundamental violations of the egalitarian ideals of the French Revolution. She provided a compelling account of the systematic failures by the police and the labor movement to respond to the real-world protests of the women brave enough to raise their voices against their oppression, thus enabling the men in their midst to continue firing them from their jobs and brutalizing them at home. Beauvoir's move from abstract ideals of equality to real-world acquiescence in their betrayal profoundly influenced the direction of the feminist movement in the post-war era. Yet she did not content herself with this achievement. The second sex extended its real-world analysis to people who understood their gender identities in ways that defied the traditional male-female dichotomy. Her book provided an extended analysis of the ways in which the modern separation of home and work enabled transgendered people to hide their loving relationships within the privacy of their homes, but only if they were willing to act as normal guys and dolls at work and in many other spheres of engagement. Beauvoir considered this form of gender domination no less oppressive than those that had previously preoccupied feminist activists. She called on the movement to form a united front with gays and lesbians in a broader campaign for existential justice. This is precisely why her book continues to serve as a landmark 3/4 of a century after its original publication. Rather than focus on the obvious differences between each form of gender domination, her existential analysis encouraged the construction of a broad-based liberation movement united by a common understanding of the interspherical dynamics of their different-seeming predicaments. At the time de Beauvoir published her book in 1949, she understood her work as part of a much larger debate, involving Merleau-Ponty, Sartre, and many others, over the existential implications of the ongoing struggle by modern men and women to create meaningful lives for themselves out of their fragmented spherical existences in time and space. Yet her writings are the only ones from that era that continue to influence real-world debate. Even in the Academy, the great existentialist works of the past have been pushed to the periphery of sustained attention. Instead, starting in the 1960s, the rising generation of serious intellectuals increasingly took a very different approach to social justice, which, by the end of the Cold War, had decisively displaced existential concerns at the center of earlier debates. Under the new paradigm, it was considered a big mistake to look upon one's real-world struggles against domination and self-betrayal as a crucial source of insight into the principles of justice that should guide efforts at reform. Instead, the new generation approached the question of social justice through a thought experiment that invited them to look upon the modern world from an Olympian perspective. To be sure, the intellectual leaders of this movement disagreed on the precise design of this decisive thought experiment, with breakthrough books by Jürgen Habermas and John Rawls playing key roles in driving the debate. Rawls asked his followers to put themselves behind a veil of ignorance, in which they would not know what place they would occupy in society before they began to bargain over the terms of the social contract that would govern their power relationships. Habermas asked them to imagine themselves in an ideal speech situation where they could debate the nature of universal principles of human dignity that should apply at all times and places throughout the world. There are important differences between these thought experiments, which I will explore in a later chapter. The point of this book, however, is to challenge the basic premises of these exercises in self-transcendence, and call on my listeners to reconstruct an existential approach to social justice. This is especially important because the debates inspired by these alternative paradigms moved far beyond the Academy. They influenced the shape of real-world reform, and by the end of the Cold War, a new generation of progressive political and legal leaders were recommitting their countries to social justice, but redefining it in contractarian or dignitarian terms. This was true of Bill Clinton no less than Nelson Mandela, Tony Blair no less than Mikhail Gorbachev, Helmut Kohl no less than Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, and many others. Over the last 30 years, however, their brave new worlds have collapsed, leading to escalating bewilderment and despair at the future of democracy. In calling on my listeners to join me in reinvigorating an existentialist approach to social justice, I don't suggest that this paradigm shift will be enough to rebuild the foundations of a strong constitutional democracy over the next generation. Nevertheless, it will focus attention on a crucial aspect of the problem: the remarkable way the high-tech revolution has been transforming the pattern of everyday existence during the same period in which the worldwide crisis of democracy was taking place. There has been lots of fine work dealing with the Internet's sweeping impact on social and political life, but an existentialist approach puts the spotlight on an aspect of the problem that has been insufficiently appreciated: the danger that our current practices on the Internet will destroy our face-to-face relationships, at home, at work, and in many other spheres that are important in building a meaningful life for ourselves. To see my point, consider a couple of variations on my not-so-hypothetical case involving the disappointments confronting parents when they arrive too late to help their kids with their homework. Suppose, once again, that Bewildered stays in the kitchen and leaves it to his spouse to get their alienated children ready for bed. At that point, Bewildered enters the living room to express his gratitude, but this effort is interrupted by a text on his phone. His boss wants to discuss issues involving his overtime work. He goes to his laptop to respond, and finds himself embroiled in 2 hours of intense discussion of a series of documents displayed on the screen. When the give-and-take finally ends around midnight, Bewildered looks up to see his spouse reading a book. But when he suggests that it's time to go to bed, she no longer pretends that everything is okay. Instead, she bursts into tears and angrily confronts him about their lack of time together. When Bewildered returns to work the next day, he is determined to change his working conditions to reduce the danger of a family breakup. He asks his boss for a meeting to talk things over, and she replies that she is happy to do so. When Bewildered arrives for his half-hour appointment, however, the conversation takes a disappointing turn. As he begins with a brief survey of possible solutions to the overtime problem, he sees his boss constantly glancing at her laptop as urgent requests for attention keep distracting her. Their meeting quickly degenerates into a disjointed series of 1-minute sound bites in which his boss announces one or another possible solution, but doesn't really listen to Bewildered's replies. The conversation goes nowhere, and Bewildered leaves her office frustrated and angry. He not only faces more last-minute overtime demands from his boss, but must deal with an increasingly estranged family when he gets home. Nevertheless, he must confront the fact that he has only 18 hours a day to construct a meaningful life for himself, and that the Internet can make it even more difficult, both at home and at work, to engage in successful efforts to resolve the inevitable interspherical dilemmas of modern life. This book invites you to confront the implications of this postmodern predicament. For the first time since humanity emerged on this planet, we are shifting endlessly from physical to virtual reality, trying to live 2 lives at the same time. In emphasizing the extraordinary perplexities generated by our dual existence, I do not suggest that we should throw away our cell phones and march back into the 20th century. The Internet can vastly enrich our lives as well as destroy them. The challenge is to define the real-world contexts in which the prospect of self-destruction posed by our double lives is a clear and present danger, and consider whether our battered democracies are strong enough to take steps that can decisively reduce the tragic dynamics unleashed by the high-tech revolution of the 21st century. I will divide my confrontation with these questions into 3 parts. The first, the longest, begins by recognizing that the bewilderment breakdowns I have described greatly oversimplify the ways in which we respond to.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?